Hi everybody, welcome to this interview with Adele Hay, who is the author of Bronte Reimagined. This interview was due to take place at the University of Huddersfield Anne Bronte Day, which was called Discovering Anne Bronte, and it was due to take place as part of Huddersfield Literature Festival in March. And unfortunately, due to COVID-19, as with so many things, the interview and the day didn't take place. For Bronte fans, that means we haven't had the time to celebrate Anne's bicentenary in the way we would have wanted to. Of course, the wonderful people at the parsonage are going to be moving a lot of that to next year for us. But we wanted to take the opportunity to come and talk about Adele's book. So we're going to redo the interview that we were going to do back in March, and we hope you very much enjoy it. Adele Hay, who's the author of Anne Bronte Reimagined, has been a lifelong fan, I think it's fair to say, of the Brontes from her first visit to the parsonage when she was young. And that enthusiasm and that passion for the Brontes, and particularly her passion for Anne, led her to writing this book and to begin pursuing a study of Anne at an academic level. And it gives me a great pleasure to have a chat with Adele in depth about Anne today. So thank you very much for talking to me, Adele.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. So if we can start then with the kind of, I guess, a big question, but hopefully one that's easy for you to answer, which is what kind of inspired you to write this book?
I'm a big fan of the Brontes and have been for a very long time. And I think I came to Anne quite late, so I was very familiar already with Emily and Charlotte and had read Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre and, you know, Charlotte's other novels that aren't quite as well known. And I'd always been told that Anne Bronte was the boring Bronte and not really worth reading. And unfortunately for me, I believed that for a very long time. I think like most people do. So when I first read Anne's books, I was completely blown away and I was overwhelmed by just how much I'd been lied to. And I couldn't reconcile the author who wrote Agnes Grey and Wildfell Hall with this with this image I'd been given of someone who was very quiet and not quite as talented as Charlotte and Emily. And so I read Samantha Ellis's book, Take Courage, which came out a few years ago, and was very pleased that finally Anne was getting some more modern recognition for the stuff that she'd written. And then I read your book and Sophie Franklin's book that kind of brought the texts of Emily and Charlotte into the 21st century, gave them a bit more context, historical and kind of modern, and just highlighted how relevant they still are. And I wanted to contribute to that celebration of the Brontes' works and also highlight just how talented Anne is and how a lot of the things that she was writing about nearly 200 years ago are still very relevant today. And she's still very readable, which I think a lot of people, they don't know that going in. They think the books are going to be a bit fusty or hard to get into, but they're not at all. But yeah, I just wanted to try and celebrate her talent a little bit.
Perfect. And you have, and it's wonderful. I mentioned in kind of introducing you that you write in the book that your first visit to the parsonage was when you were 12, and that visit obviously made a huge impression on you. Do you remember your thoughts on Anne from that visit at all, or what kind of impression you got of her from visiting her home?
I think the first time I visited, I was 12 or 13, and so I don't remember a lot about it, but I do remember just kind of the memories of being inside the parsonage itself are very vivid, and I think that's testament to just how good the Parsonage Museum is at bringing the history of the family to life. It was a memory that stayed with me for a long time, visiting their home. And I think more than being struck by any of the Brontes individually, at that age, I paid a lot of attention to, or my attention was grabbed by how much they collaborated as children. So I was drawn more to their juvenilia on my first visit, especially, you know, the tiny books and things. And I was looking at these tiny books that they'd written about imaginary worlds that they'd created together. And that was something that I did myself at home, you know, writing terrible fantasy after reading Lord of the Rings and making up islands and things like that. So it was quite nice as another teenager who was writing that kind of thing. Well, not on the same scale as them, obviously, because that is just, you know, it's crazy the level of detail that they went into. But for somebody who wrote a lot at home anyway as a teenager, it was quite amazing to come into the Parsonage Museum and learn that these famous authors were doing exactly the same thing. And even though there was almost 2 centuries between us, it felt suddenly like I could relate to these historical figures who might otherwise have felt completely alien to me. But so I was more drawn to the family as a whole. And as I just said before, my first impressions of Anne were those that were kind of given to me by the people around me. So I went to the parsonage for the first time with people who were very big fans of Emily, and my mum's friend gave me her old copy of Wuthering Heights, which I still have, and I was very much an Emily person for a very long time. And I think the image that I had of Anne from the first couple of visits to Haworth were those that a lot of people have. So she was very quiet, very underrepresented, not quite as celebrated as the others. And it's been interesting to look at where all of those opinions have come from and how they build up on top of each other until you read Anne's books and realise that most of what you thought you knew about her was completely wrong.
So that's kind of opens me up, I guess, into talking about the next question I wanted to ask you, which is about some of the myths, the mythology surrounding Anne, which obviously is something your book sets out to challenge and dispel. And I wondered if you could talk about what you see as one or two of the main myths associated with Anne, which you kind of gestured to a little bit already, but also where you think those myths have come from.
So when I started writing the book, I asked friends and family what they thought about Anne, and a lot of the time the same kind of words were coming up. So quiet, reserved, shy, meek and mild are another couple of words that are often associated with Anne. So there are all these assumptions about her character. So she didn't particularly like people. She didn't want recognition. She wasn't very ambitious. All things that you'd associate with somebody, you know, being quite quiet and very shy. And another one of the big misconceptions that I heard a lot of people have about Anne was that she just wasn't as talented as Charlotte and Emily. And you know, you can read this even in introductions to Agnes Grey and The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, where a critic will say Anne had her own talents, but you know, she wasn't a genius or anything. And it almost feels like people are excusing their taste, or say trying to say, you know, I really like these books, but I acknowledge that they're not as good. Almost as if your taste is inferior, if you like Anne Bronte, which is
like there has to be a hierarchy between the Brontes.
Yeah. So the two main things that I wanted to talk about in the book were that even if she was quiet and shy, it doesn't mean that she wasn't ambitious, and that she wasn't as talented. So in terms of Anne's personality, I think a lot of the myths around Anne's personality come from Charlotte, which is quite unfortunate because I don't think Charlotte did this maliciously, but I think she was possibly trying to save her sister's reputations, especially with the biographical notice that she wrote that appeared in a new edition of Wuthering Heights and Agnes Grey. So she wrote in the biographical notice that Anne's was naturally a sensitive, reserved, and dejected nature. What she saw sank very deeply into her mind. It did her harm. And things like, she also compared her to Emily and said Anne's character was milder and more subdued. She wanted the power, the fire, the originality of her sister, but was well endowed with quiet virtues of her own. And she, I wouldn't say that Anne was particularly outspoken, personality-wise, but I take issue with quiet being seen as a negative trait. She was very strong, but that you can be subtle with that strength and you can be quiet with it. But yeah, so a lot of the misconceptions we have about Anne's personality have unfortunately come from Charlotte, and also Charlotte's first biographer, Elizabeth Gaskell. Yeah. So Elizabeth Gaskell wrote the first biography of Charlotte, and I think she was trying to present Charlotte in a very kind of positive way. Elizabeth Gaskell was trying to do for Charlotte what Charlotte was trying to do for Emily and Anne.
Yeah.
And trying to kind of find excuses for or justify some of the coarseness that they were accused of in their writing. And unfortunately for everybody reading those books later on, it kind of comes across as if Charlotte was this long-suffering eldest sister to a very tragic family who had to look out for her sisters all the time. In Elizabeth Gaskell's book, Anne's writing is hardly given any consideration at all. Her death takes up almost an entire chapter, and it's very, again, I think it gives more of a sense of how Charlotte reacted to it and how it affected Charlotte's life rather than what it tells us about Anne. But, so we've got two very, very early accounts of Anne's life, one from her sister and one from a close friend of her sister. And that kind of gives those accounts an authority that's continued for the last. So a lot of the ideas we have about Anne as a person have come from Charlotte's biographical notice and Elizabeth Gaskell's biography.
They're stubborn and ingrained ideas, aren't they? They're kind of rarely questioned. They're just kind of so taken for granted that that's how it is because Charlotte said that's how it is, without that context that this is part of a strategy on Charlotte's part. And of course, Gaskell didn't meet Anne. No.
Elizabeth Gaskell never met Anne. She met Charlotte after, Emily and Bramwell and Anne had died, and Elizabeth Gaskell only really had second-hand accounts to go off. So she had Charlotte, she had the close family friend Ellen Nussey, she had the Bronte's father to speak to, but she never actually met Anne herself. But sorry.
No, it was fine. I was going to say one of the good things about your book is that it follows on from, I think you mentioned when you started speaking, Samantha Ellis's Take Courage from 2017, which itself followed Nick Holland's In Search of Anne Bronte from 2016, and Nick has obviously published another book this year on Anne. So it's really great then that there's a kind of this renewed attention on this kind of, the so-called kind of boring, forgotten Bronte, who is far from any of those things. Can you kind of sum up how you think your book Anne Bronte Reimagined is different from Samantha Ellis or Nick Holland's title, or do you see yourself kind of very much following in their footsteps?
Yeah, I've definitely followed in their footsteps as somebody who hopes that Anne's reputation, will be better than it was after her bicentennial. With my book, I really wanted to kind of mix up biography with literary criticism and look at how a lot of the themes that Anne felt were important are still relevant today. So, and talk about how she's still very, very readable. Yeah, and just kind of highlight just how talented she was. I mean, she was very, very good at building characters and making them incredibly believable.
So one of the things that you talk about in your book, which I found really fascinating, was Anne's sense of humour. And I think Bronte humour is something we definitely don't talk about enough. So I wondered if you could say a little bit more about Anne's humour and maybe where you think we can find it in her writing.
So I think this relates a lot to how Anne built really believable characters. They're all very well fleshed out and just very personable. I feel like she was very good at understanding the psychology of people. And so all of the characters are very consistent. Even when they kind of grow and change, it's a very natural growth and character progression and things. And so you have scenes like in The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, Helen is trying to convince her aunt that Arthur Huntingdon is somebody who is suitable to marry. You know, her aunt is saying he is a terrible man. He's going to lose all of his money to gambling. He's also going to go to hell because he's just a horrible human being. And Helen is kind of blinded by how much she likes this handsome, exciting man. And she I really like the way that Anne wrote this, because on the one hand she's trying to have a serious discussion about her religious beliefs, universal salvation, and at the same time it's very consistent for the characters to be talking about this.
Yeah.
So you have this whole dialogue where Helen is quoting the Bible at her aunt and saying, I don't believe that Arthur will go to hell, and even if he does, he won't be there forever, because how could a merciful God, you know, endorse eternal punishment? And Helen's aunt is just completely shocked and says, Helen, where did you read this? Where have you learnt all this? And Helen very calmly and perhaps impertinently says, in my Bible, aunt, like, where else am I going to read it? And it just, I really enjoy those kind of snippets of personality. And that line in particular, when I first read it, it made me think of one of the diary papers that Emily wrote.
Yeah.
So in the diary paper, Emily wrote that their Aunt Bramwell has come into the kitchen just now and said, where are your feet, Anne? Anne answered, on the floor, aunt. It's that same kind of
very matter of fact, very dry humour, isn't it?
Yeah, the kind of the kind of thing that you might say to a family member when you know how far you can push them. And she brings that in really well to a lot of the family dynamics. So you've got Gilbert Markham's family. He's got a younger sister and he's got a teenage brother who isn't afraid to talk back to his eldest brother and say utterly ridiculous things that are very in line for a teenager. And you don't really think of teenagers as being the same back then as they are now. But you read some of Fergus's lines and you think he is clearly an incredibly annoying teenager and, you know, winding his oldest brother up. And I just think it's incredibly clever the way that she not buried, but the way that she layered the serious kind of conversations within a very relatable, humorous family dynamic.
Yeah, thank you. So I guess one of the things I also wanted to talk to you about, going from humour to a darker subject, which is illness, because you speak quite a lot in the book about Anne's illness. from 1837, and how biographers have attributed that period of illness to different things and written about it in different ways. Can you say a little bit more about Anne's illness, what your view of the illness is, and how do you think it impacted her?
So this was when Anne was at school, and at the time Charlotte was a teacher at the school, and there's quite a lot that's been written about the kind of distance that opened up between Charlotte and Anne while they were at school. And I think a lot of this is because Charlotte was, she was very preoccupied with her own issues at the time. You read her diaries from then, and they're absolutely brutal. She really, really hated being a teacher, I think, at the time. And so you've got this distance that kind of grew between Anne and Charlotte. And so when Anne became ill, there was a lot of, I think Charlotte felt partially responsible because it passed her by. And so, Charlotte had written in letters much later on that she always felt that Anne was close to death, or that Anne was meant for an early grave. And so you've got this whole narrative that's built up around Anne of being kind of weak from birth, susceptible to a lot of illnesses. Charlotte was constantly worried about her and her health, and that was something that was really exaggerated by Elizabeth Gaskell when she presented Charlotte as somebody who was constantly kind of looking over her shoulder at her youngest sister and being very worried about her all the time. The illness that Anne had as well, I think, it kind of triggered a religious crisis. So if Anne felt that she was close to death, she was what I can get from, Anne's books and from her poetry, especially when she's writing about religion, she was almost a worrier, an overthinker. She was very logical in the way that she thought about things and came to conclusions, I think, but she was incredibly analytical. I think it gave her a lot of the strength that she needed to be completely confident in her own beliefs, and that's where her beliefs about universal salvation really started to become a bit more concrete in her life, and she felt confident enough to write about them in her books. And
sounds like real self-knowledge and self-growth, and that period of illness helped to, or from the way you were describing her, it made her a very critical thinker, a very reflective thinker, and as you said, someone who's so self-assured in her own mind, which in itself kind of really undermines this idea that she's somebody who wasn't intelligent or I guess lacked genius, because it suggests kind of deep critical self-reflective thought, if anything at all. I want to talk to you about Anne and Emily, because they were obviously very close, and in terms of the siblings, and you talked quite a bit about the kind of strained relationship relationship between Charlotte and Anne at times, and with Emily, of course, Anne created this wonderful imaginary world of Gondal, and kind of done that split from Charlotte and Branwell. The diary papers, again, which you've mentioned, kind of perhaps, I think, or maybe you can comment on this, invite us to think about their relationship in a very kind of private way, a very intimate way. So I wondered if you could say how you think, or what you think of their relationship, and how that relationship, I guess, found expression in that kind of private poetic world.
There's the famous quotation from Ellen Nussey, which is that Anne and Emily were like twins. They were, inseparable. They were very, very close sisters and very good friends. Sorry. All four of the Bronte children, they collaborated together to create the Glasstown stories. And I think Charlotte and Branwell probably had very similar tastes when it came to what they were interested in reading and writing about. And so did Emily and Anne. So there isn't any prose left that was written by Anne. We only have poems from Gondal that Anne wrote. And I think almost all of them are written from women's point of view. And again, that's completely different to Branwell and Charlotte, who were writing these very imposing, Byronic, powerful figures who were backstabbing each other all the time. I mean, there's plenty of drama in the Gondal poetry, but it's a lot more focused on, well, you have a lot of people who've been imprisoned, a lot of powerful people who are feeling very lonely, or they've been left at home. But the thing with the Gondal poems is that they gave equal importance to the women who were left behind.
And it's just so sad, as we say, we don't have the full transcript of everything, just to really get, inside the kind of breadth and depth of what they created. So let's have a chat about the editing of Anne's work, specifically by Charlotte. Can you talk to us about some of the editorial changes that Charlotte makes to Anne's work and the impact that you think that that's had on her reputation?
So editing in general is something that's usually quite a positive experience, or it should be, and it's something that can really improve the quality of a book, and it happens to every book. Every author has to work with an editor to get the book out into the world. Unfortunately for Anne, she didn't get to have that positive experience because a lot of the edits that were made to her books and her poetry were made after she died. And this is something that really, really interests me, and it's something that I'm going to go and study a bit more. And I wrote a whole chapter about how Anne was edited by Charlotte and by others. And I'd like to read a little bit about how the Tenant of Wildfell Hall itself was initially suppressed and then later edited. When Wildfell Hall was first published, the reaction of the general public was one of shock. Its notoriety resulted in a second edition, published with a new preface by Anne, in which she deftly and tactfully defended herself against accusations of coarseness and vulgarity. Anne fully acknowledges that both Agnes Grey and Wildfell Hall present unpalatable truths that the reader may find unpleasant, but that is the most important thing about them. They may be unpalatable, but they are truths. She apologises for the places in which she may have gone too far, but still is able to justify her authorial decisions. She wrote, "When we have to do with vice and vicious characters, I maintain it is better to depict them as they really are than as they would wish to appear. To represent a bad thing in its least offensive light is doubtless the most agreeable course for a writer of fiction to pursue, but is it the most honest or the safest? Is it better to reveal the snares and pitfalls of life to the young and thoughtless traveller, or to cover them with branches and flowers? If there were less of this delicate concealment of facts, the whispering peace, peace, when there is no peace, there would be less of sin and misery to the young of both sexes who are left to wring their bitter knowledge from experience." Throughout the preface, Anne stresses how important it was for her to write truthful portrayals of unsavoury characters, stripping them of any romanticism they may be treated with by other authors. There's no happy ending for Helen and Arthur Huntingdon. Wildfell Hall turns its head on the notion that reformed rakes make the best husbands, and it does so very explicitly. Anne stood by her novel and the choices she'd made while writing it. Charlotte appears not to have agreed, however, and when her publisher approached Charlotte with the idea of republishing her sister's novels after their deaths, she implied that Wildfell Hall should not be included, as its subject matter was so in contrast to the character of the gentle, retiring, inexperienced writer who wrote the book as if accomplishing a painful penance and a severe duty. Charlotte readily agreed to the joint republication of Agnes Grey and Wuthering Heights, and it was in that edition's biographical notice of Ellis and Acton Bell that Charlotte made clear what she thought of Anne's second novel. The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, by Acton Bell, had likewise an unfavourable reception, she wrote. At this I cannot wonder. The choice of subject was an entire mistake. Nothing less congruous with the writer's nature could be conceived. Charlotte's dismissal of Wildfell Hall in such a manner effectively suppressed the original text of Wildfell Hall until interest in Anne began to increase in the 60s and 70s, at least in the UK. The American publisher of Wildfell Hall, Harper of New York, kept the original text in print, though without Anne's preface. By 1854, the Brontes' works were incredibly popular, but Wildfell Hall still had not been published. The only versions available were the expensive 3-volume editions published by Newby in 1848. The publisher Thomas Hodgson saw an opportunity to republish a cheap single-volume edition of Wildfell Hall as part of the Parlour Library series to try and reach a wider market. Condensing a 3-volume edition into 1 volume meant there had to be some alterations. The page layouts were changed in order to fit more text onto the page, but large edits still had to be carried out to make the text short enough to fit into this pocket-sized edition. This is where the most significant damage took place. In the 1996 Penguin Classics edition of Wildfell Hall, the editor Stevie Davies notes that the text in the 1854 edition is corrupt, highly expurgated, and would become the basis for the most subsequent British editions. It is worthless to the modern editor. So Charlotte did not like Wildfell Hall, and she didn't want it republished, and effectively her suppression of the novel meant that the version of Wildfell Hall that we were presented with for so long was very, very different from the original. You know, people refer to it as a mutilated text, a mangled text, worthless to a modern editor. And that's, I think, combined with all of the very negative opinions of Anne's personality, or the opinions that she was less talented than others, when you're presented with this incomplete version, it's easy to see why those ideas were perpetuated. I have a copy of that book. It was given to me for a birthday one year, and it's from one of those services on Amazon where you order it and it's printed to order. Oh, and yeah, it says on the first page that it's complete and unabridged, and then you skip to the chapter that was cut in the mangled text, and it's, you know, it's not there, so it's not complete and unabridged. But there are still versions of Wildfell Hall that you can go into Waterstones or, you know, any other bookshop and pick up, and they don't have Anne's preface to the second edition, which was kind of a revolutionary thing for anyone to have written at the time anyway. Yeah. And they don't have the book set up as a letter, so you miss that first, the prologue. That's completely gone. You don't realise until much later on that, you know, the whole book has been written as a letter from Gilbert to his brother-in-law. And there are whole passages that I think the editors must have thought were the most unpalatable sections that are removed. You know, there's a chapter where Helen is worrying about how Arthur seems to be jealous of their newborn son. Mm-hmm. And it's very, very dark. It's a very uncomfortable read. You know, she's trying to placate this grown man and convince him and reassure him that the baby's not taken his place, and, you know, why don't you try and interact with your son? And he kind of dismisses it, and it's very, it made me really angry that parts like that had been removed. So yeah, Charlotte, her edits and her suppression of certain, you know, of Wildfell Hall, while she may have been well-meaning, I think did quite a lot of unintentional damage. And there's things like Anne's last poem that she wrote when she first found out that she had tuberculosis is very, very sad. It's very, you get the sense that she was very frustrated. She was questioning her belief. There are things in there that kind of suggest she was saying, well, I've done everything I could and I'm still being chosen to die, and this isn't fair. And it's very, very angry in parts. And Charlotte's edit of that poem makes it seem like Anne was fed up of being on Earth and, you know, quite willing to die. And escape how terrible life on Earth was. Yeah, but they, again, like with the biographical notice that Charlotte wrote, the edits that she made to Anne's poetry and her books after Anne's death have stuck around for a very long time.
So thank you. I guess you've raised there the kind of Anne's last poem and its poignancy, and one of the things that I think so many Bronte fans and scholars always are, I guess, overwhelmed by is the events between 1847 and 1849, the incredible success of those sisters in a literary context, and the juxtaposition of that with these devastating and successive personal family traumas, successive grief. In Anne's case, of course, she sees Branwell and then Emily pass, and then with her own illness makes that decision to go back to Scarborough, which was obviously a deeply personal reason for her. I wondered if you could say a little bit more about Scarborough and that experience, and also how that kind of, I guess, episode, for want of a better word, in her life has kind of also shaped her legacy.
So Scarborough was somewhere that Anne had really enjoyed visiting when she was a governess, and she was very moved by the sea. I think she was, there's a drawing of Anne's that is going to be on display at the Parsonage Museum next year, hopefully still, of a young woman kind of looking out to sea at this sunrise or sunset, and it's very beautiful, it's very hopeful. It's not the kind of thing that you'd expect someone to write who is kind of very shy and retiring, and she drew that, I think, even before she'd seen the sea. So when she saw it, she kind of fell in love with it, and Scarborough became a very important place to her. When she was ill, because she had seen other family members suffering through the same illness, she was very, very aware of what it was going to do to her, which must have been absolutely terrifying. And there are accounts that Anne tried everything she could to prolong her life, to try and find a cure for herself. And you can read it even in her last poem, where she's quite angry about the fact that this is happening to her. She had things that she wanted to do. She wrote to Ellen Nussey about how she still had things that she wanted to achieve. She didn't want her life to have had so little purpose, which I think she was somebody who was quite hard on herself. So it was unfortunate that she felt that way. And when you read it, you think, but Anne, you were already, doing lots of wonderful things. Her decision to go to Scarborough, I think, was, as much as she loved the place, it was also influenced by the fact that going to the seaside and getting some fresh air and things would have been very good for her. And the doctor even recommended it, as soon as you can go and get a change of air, I think you should go. So she was very, very determined to go. Charlotte, having seen all of her other siblings pass away from the same disease, she understandably was very worried about Anne travelling and tried to prolong this for as long as she could. And I think it just goes to show how determined Anne was to get her own way quite a lot. Even if she'd never spoken back to Charlotte particularly before, this was something that she really, really wanted to do, and she got her own way in the end and got to go to Scarborough and got to go to the church and insisted on visiting the beach on her own without support, and went to the baths and things like that. I think it was, and they went to York on the way there as well. I think they stopped and looked at the Minster, which was another thing that was very important to Anne. It was somewhere that she enjoyed visiting, and she'd been there with Emily previously. And I think that the choice to go to Scarborough was, it showed how determined she was. It showed that she didn't want to give in to the illness that she had. She made the decision and she stuck to it, and she made sure that she got to go. And so when you read about Anne's death in, say, Elizabeth Gaskell's book about Charlotte, it's almost reduced to, this is how much Charlotte loved Anne. You don't really get a sense of how it affected Anne or how much of it was her own decision. And so it's been kind of interpreted in two different ways. You have the interpretation where, Charlotte was, this is how Charlotte was affected by it, and Anne's intentions are almost completely ignored. But then on the other side, when you read Anne's last letter and you read her last poem, you get a sense of Anne as being completely different to the one who's often presented to us. And she, even in her letter to Ellen Nussey, where she says, please will you come to Scarborough with me, and Charlotte doesn't really want to go. She's almost kind of apologetic for bothering her, but is still kind of determined. She's very considerate of everybody else, as much as she's doing this for her sister and her father's sake. She wants to keep living for herself. And you can very easily reduce it to, oh, it's just part of the Bronte tragedy. But I think it's better to see that experience as, this is how courageous Anne was. This was her quiet strength on full show, so to speak. I don't really think I can say anything more than.
No, you've said loads. And actually, I guess I think kind of a lot of what you are saying is this idea that there's probably, again, a lot more to be said about Anne's experience there in a personal way that maybe moves beyond just how Charlotte positions things, which I guess is something that we're both obviously really interested in. So my final question to you then is, sadly, none of us can ever know the Brontes. I know we all desperately want to be transported back to the kitchen in the parsonage to see what was really going on, and to see what was happening, and to see them in real life. But despite that, what do you think Anne Bronte was like as a person? How would you describe her or sum her up?
I think she was very determined. She had a very strong sense of right and wrong, but that didn't mean that she would condemn someone instantly. I think she was a very good listener and someone who was incredibly perceptive, and that really comes across in the way that she creates her characters. Like I said earlier, they're very believable, they're very fleshed out, and I think that can only come from being a writer who is very observant, of the people that they interact with. She was also her biggest critic. When you read her poetry especially, and she refers to herself as a sinner or a humble wretch or somebody who is just trying to do their best, you read them and you think, gosh, you're being incredibly hard on yourself. I mean, I know that everybody wants to, I know that she was trying to work on herself all the time and see everything as an opportunity for growth rather than as something negative. But she was also incredibly harsh on herself sometimes as well. I think she was not complacent in any way. If she achieved something, she would allow herself to be pleased with it, but I don't think she'd become complacent. She wouldn't stop that momentum. I think she's just I admire that a lot. you know, as someone who worries a lot and overthinks, maybe I kind of read her poetry sometimes and think, yeah, you know, it's good to be critical of yourself, but don't go too far. But yeah, I think she had a lot of very positive values and very positive character traits that we don't really get to see an awful lot of in general.
Well, I think your book definitely begins to certainly not only bring her out of the shadows, but really shine that light on another side to Anne, give her her voice, give her her agency back, and not in the least show kind of how badly some of her work was edited as well, and celebrate her. So thank you so much for talking to me, Adele, and thank you everybody for listening to this. I hope you've really enjoyed it.